course of doing the debriefings of all the hostages held in Lebanon on our hunt for the CIA station chief, we were able to determine that the hijackers of TWA Flight 847 that was on the ground in Beirut, the very famous picture of a terrorist hanging out the window with the pilot and a gun to his head, we were able to connect the dots between that hijacked cell and the hostage takings. And we were able to identify three primary players there. One was Ali Atwa, the other was Hassan Izzaldin, and the third was Imad Mognia, or as we called him, the Ghost. One of our agents was shot and killed there in 76 76.
Actually?
Yeah.
Was it like a...
Unsolved.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Was there any hints of it ever being...
Depends on who you ask.
What is your opinion on it?
I think he was targeted. It's a cold case. Arlington County had it for years, still does. The Bureau investigated it. My old outfit investigated it. I was able to get them to reopen the case a few years ago and relook at it, but this whole circumstance was very odd. He and his wife were coming out of, there used to be a famous steakhouse there, and now I'm blanking on it. They attribute it to a robbery, but nothing was stolen. Nothing was ever said at the time in the encounter, and he was just shot and killed right there in front of his wife. His name was Jack Hearst.
I'm sorry to hear that. And it's even with, how often does that seem to happen to? I mean, we'll dive into, the case that you saw when you're 16 years old that almost kind of, put the wheels in motion, for lack of a better word. But it seems like that does happen, and it's something that the American populace is probably pretty blind to in terms of it happening. So how often are there kind of cases like that occur that have gone cold, or, the agency might have a better idea what's going on, but it just gets left to the wind, for, lack of a better word for that?
Well, I think for the most part, law enforcement at the local, state, and federal level does a better job of closing some of them today than they did back in the 60s or the 70s or even into the 80s on my watch. But there's a good number of cold cases that will forever go unsolved. I'm sad to say, just over the length of time. Time can sometimes help you in a cold case, but in other times it can't, because witnesses die, files get lost, files get destroyed over the course of history and so forth. But, it's unfortunate. You made me just think of that area. I know there was a Virginia state trooper that was shot and killed that's at his residence. I can't remember if that was in Northern Virginia or Richmond. And it's a cold case. I was just going back and forth with an old FBI buddy of mine that we worked together, and he said that that's still a cold case. So, they happen.
Would you say, from a counterintelligence perspective on some of these cold cases, it's better to let the situation almost die down too? If you have an inkling of maybe 10, 15 years of what country, let's say it was a foreign country that committed the act, is it better to let it die down versus, if you revisit that case, it could cause, a number of factors in terms of relations with, let's say it's Iran, or pick any other, country that we have hostile relations with already?
I think at times it takes a while to figure them out. I mean, I was just talking to an academic friend of mine that looks at Iranian targeted assassinations around the world, most notably in North America. And surprisingly, historically, there has been a few. There was one in my area in 1980 or 81 where an Iranian former diplomat, Ali Tabatabai, was assassinated by a Iranian hitman that actually stole a U.S. postal van dressed as a mailman, pith helmet and all, knocked on the door and shot and killed this Iranian dissident, former diplomat, at his front door, and then fled to Iran. And the scenario was right out of James Grady's 3 Days of the Condor, famous movie that was actually the book was 6 Days of the Condor, but Robert Redford and Faye Dunaway made it 3 Days of the Condor back in the 70s. And so you have those kinds of cases that just happen. And I actually had reopened that case on my watch as well. But, I was there the day that he was shot and killed. And so, some of these cases I remain convinced will go unsolved because, the hourglass of time is turned against me. Mm-hmm. And there's not many of us left that really remember those. And I'm not saying that they don't care. People don't care, but I think you get so caught up in the moment of the current threat streams, the current cases, that it's very difficult to look at cases that, 30, 40, sometimes now 50 years old.
Mm-hmm. We're going to get back to Iran here in a sec, but I did want to jump up to talking about Beirut, but specifically because, we've been trying to work this out for a couple months now, and it just so happens that you end up coming the day before, 9/11, when we're going to be remembering one of the most impactful things that has happened in U.S. history, and of course set the line for what decades followed. But of course, a lot of Americans might think that 9/11 is kind of where, quote unquote, terrorism started, where the war on terror started. But of course, that's not correct. It was kind of the conglomeration or, the peak of what has been decades of building, specifically with Beirut. Could you maybe speak to what was going on in the Middle East in the 1980s and, kind of how that foundation was beginning to be laid?
Sure, be happy to. In essence, we were losing. We were losing badly, beginning with, it depends on the era of time you want to examine, but if you look at the horrific acts of terror predominantly in the early 80s, which would have been, the 83 U.S. embassy bombing, what we called the first Beirut embassy bombing. Then you had the U.S. Marine Corps barracks bombing. You had the second embassy bombing in Beirut in 1984. We also had a bombing at the U.S. Embassy in Kuwait during that same time period. Then we had the kidnapping of the CIA station chief, Bill Buckley, one of my cases that I worked on, along with a whole range of hostage taking of Americans, French, British, Russians, even Korean, Irish nationals. And then you had a overwhelming scope of international hijackings. And the whole center of gravity was Beirut. All roads led to Beirut in the early 80s on up until the late 80s, with pretty much a terrorist group, which was Iran-sponsored at the time, which we really didn't really know. It took us a while to figure it out, called the Islamic Jihad Organization, which was ultimately Hezbollah. So if you're looking at a flowchart, you had state sponsor of terror, Iran, under a cover name of the Islamic Jihad Organization, or the IJO as we called them. And then you had Hezbollah, which ultimately were the tactical kinds of boots on the ground that were carrying out the hijackings, kidnapping the Westerners, putting together the car bombs. And Iran pretty much was utilizing this concept that we knew very little about at the time, with the asymmetric warfare against us, to drive the Americans out of Lebanon, which they were fairly successful in doing. So as you look back on that time period, and interesting, I was just talking to Jack Carr about this yesterday. It seems like when you fast forward to the events of 9/11, a lot of folks in the mainstream media, in the counterterrorism arena, believe that terrorism began on 9/11, but we had this slow burn, beginning in the late 70s on up into the 80s and the 90s, and you could almost see it coming. I mean, we knew when I left Washington, I was the deputy chief of our counterterrorism division, and we were very rarely in front of any threats. Most of our time and effort was spent on picking up the pieces, picking up the body bags, almost like a first responder or a smoke jumper or a response vehicle from a police department that when you call 911 and you ask for help. So we would have an attack wherever. We would go to that event, investigate what we could, come back, and just wait for the other one to happen. And we were never really in front of any of the threats during that time period. So the war on terror really began in modern history, beginning in 1972 with the Munich massacre, by the Black September organization.
Could you maybe explain that for maybe a viewer that hadn't heard of that situation before?
Sure. In the early 1970s, there was a radical Palestinian group called the Black September Organization, which was pretty much the PLO, Yasser Arafat's secret intelligence service. And their job was to target Jews, Israelis, Americans around the globe. And long before Hezbollah came on board in the 80s, long before Al-Qaeda on the events of 9/11, in the 70s, this organization, the Black September Organization, pretty much wrote the textbook on global terror. They carried out unbelievable strike in Munich in 1972 at the Olympics, killing 11 Israeli athletes, holding them hostage and murdering them, one of which was also a dual American citizen. They also were responsible for the killings of two of our diplomats, American diplomats in Khartoum, hijackings, hostage takings and seizures of Israeli embassies, the killing of Israeli intelligence officers, the rocket attacks of El Al Airlines. The list just went on. And they also were the group that was responsible for the killing of my neighbor. I did not know it at the time, but a gentleman by the name of Colonel Joe Alon, who was the Israeli military attaché assigned to the Israeli embassy in Washington, D.C. So as you step back and you craft and you look at the history of terrorism beginning in the 70s, you had all these spectacular attacks that were not at the scale of 9/11 and just the loss of life, but certainly strategic in context, meaning Olympics were targets, diplomats, airlines. And they were quite successful in a very brief period of time, 3 to 4 year window of just carrying out these spectacular events around the globe. And the actual hostage taking and the killing of the Israeli athletes in Munich in 1972 was the first terrorist attack that was broadcast live around the world because obviously media was there for the Munich Olympics.
What is going on, everybody? I'm currently editing the podcast that you guys are watching right now, but I wanted to take a quick pause in the action to say that if you're enjoying the video thus far, you could do me and the channel a huge favor and leave the video a like and comment your favorite part below. This has a massive effect on how the video is seen in the algorithm and helps it spread to more and more people. It's insane how quickly our community has grown. We're already at 20,000 subscribers, so I just want to say thank you to everyone that's been supportive thus far, and I can't wait to see where this journey continues to go. And if you're not a part of the community yet, I encourage you to subscribe. We have a lot of great content coming out over the next couple of weeks and months. And with that, let's get back to the episode. It's incredible. What would you say the feeling was on the ground in Washington as these attacks continued to add up, as these groups starting to get more relevance on the global stage? And as you were seeing, like you said, there's an escalation from maybe small level attacks to attacking something like the Olympics. Was it feeling in Washington that something big was coming? Granted, it was, decades down the line, but still, or was there still kind of a disconnect in terms of how these groups were viewed and, the power dynamics that shifted between, small terror groups in the Middle East and, of course, the United States?
Yeah, that's a great question. When you look at that era and time frame, you have to put it in context of the geopolitics of the world. Most of the old timers were Vietnam era intelligence officers and agents from my generation when I first started. And then you had the Cold War. You have the wall still up, and the number one boogeyman at the national security level was the Soviet Union. And we did not know at the time, we suspected that the Soviet Union had supported and helped a lot of these groups, but it was very disjointed and we didn't have a lot of good windows into the scope and kind of the capabilities. But the Soviet KGB during that time period in the 70s and the 80s learned that they could utilize these international terrorist groups to kind of pick at us and to provide logistic support, firearms, intelligence support, explosives, and so forth. So the national focus was the Soviet Union, geopolitics, and so forth. And so these isolated events of terror were never really a national security priority for the United States during that time period. And on a practical level, it was evident on the resources that we had devoted to the problem. You know, look, when I graduated from basic special agent school, I was sent to our counterterrorism branch, and I was one of 3 agents for the world. That in itself speaks to the kind of problem and resources that were devoted to the problem. Don't get me wrong, we had an anti-terrorism assistance office that was trying to train foreign governments. The CIA had started a counterterrorism center, which I spent a fair amount of time in and out of, but it was nothing like you would see today. And that took 9/11 to kind of change the world's perception of that. So if you go back into that time period, the 70s and the 80s, even up to the first World Trade Center bombing in 1993, there just wasn't a lot of resources devoted to the counterterrorism mission globally. And, you know, so when you start unpacking or breaking down counterterrorism from that era, after these horrific attacks in Beirut predominantly, it drove technology shifts, meaning we tried to figure out better ways to protect embassies and diplomats, which was a positive thing. You know, we learned the value of setback, the distance between where a vehicle-borne improvised explosive device could detonate and your location of your actual building. What is your setback distance? We learned that broken and flying glass killed a lot of our people. So what kind of innovative technology solutions can we put on glass? And so you develop 3M Mylar to put on glass, much like a windshield in a car where it doesn't shatter. And then you looked at some sophisticated like EOD kind of developments as to how can we find bombs better today in that time period. So there was a lot of changes in the physical security front, but it really boiled down to me in the weeds. And I've talked a lot about this over the years that, you know, when you lack the human intelligence from inside these groups, you really are blind to what actually is taking place. And on a practical level, for those that are watching this, you know, it's much like you don't really know what's going on inside the studio other than we're recording, but you would have to be in the studio to actually understand exactly what we're talking about, the scenario, how the studio looks, what we're talking about on breaks and so forth. So when you lack that kind of intelligence, it's hard to get in front of these groups and it's hard to penetrate. It's hard to be able to stop these kinds of terrorist attacks from occurring. And, you know, we went through large measures of time in a place like Beirut, predominantly due to the terrorist attacks there in the past, with just not having enough human intelligence to help us get in front of the threat.
Why do you think that was such an issue in terms of creating that human intelligence? I mean, one thing that I would think right away would be culturally, the Middle East from the U.S. is just so dynamic and so different. It's funny for, you know, the entirety of the Cold War, our greatest enemy is Russia. And we were obviously very different, especially in terms of our economic policies and theories. But at the end of the day, there was a lot of shared general culture, while I feel like the Middle East is a whole different animal. So was that one of the kind of foundations in terms of why it was difficult to develop that human intelligence? Or, what were some of the levers that weren't able to be pulled around that?
Predominantly, again, if you look at the geopolitics of the era, we had a tremendous amount of Russian language speakers. We had a tremendous amount of even Chinese language speakers and so forth. We had very few Arabic speakers. Even after we started to see the problems surface in the 70s, like with the Yom Kippur War in 73 and so forth, it really just wasn't a focus or a priority. And again, at the National Security Council level, and if even you go back in time and, I was reading for some historical research, I was doing some conversations between Kissinger and Nixon from the time period. The Soviet Union, China are the focus. So the Arab invasion of Israel in 73, they're really looking at it through the prism of, is the Soviet Union really behind Egypt in this endeavor and so forth. So looking at the granular data there, we just lack the language speakers. We lack the foreign language cultural skills that people brought to the table. There were background investigation issues, meaning at the national security level, trying to get cleared foreign nationals to join organizations like the State Department or even the FBI or the CIA were very, very difficult. And remember, too, you're dealing with a time period without social media, without the internet. So organizations like the State Department, the CIA, the FBI weren't really very well known, and in times only in a negative context. Going back to allegations of the CIA and the Kennedy assassination and the CIA's skullduggery around the world, or the perception of that. J. Edgar Hoover's FBI. It was kind of endless parade of negative kind of news and so forth. So if you look at, you're trying to recruit out of Georgetown or George Washington, Johns Hopkins, the Ivies, is this really a place that you would want to be? So it was just hard to do recruitment and so forth. And it was very, very difficult to find foreign nationals that could get into the system, could pass the background investigation, and would want to help in that measure. So I attribute that is to a large measure of some of our failures with human intelligence during that time period.
So with everything we're laying out here, I'm curious to hear your perspective on this. Would you say that you were surprised that it took as long as it did to have an event like 9/11 in terms of, we're undermanned, undergunned for all these different decades, and we're seeing kind of the wheels turning in terms of the events getting more and more drastic. So does that surprise you, or do you feel like it was something that was bound to happen, but there were underlying reasons why we didn't have an event like 9/11 until, September 11, 2000? Or was it how's the perspective on that? Were you surprised that it took as long as it did?
No, I was not surprised at all when the events of 9/11 took place. You could look at the catastrophic events that had happened going back to the Olympics in 72, Beirut in 83 and 84, the Marine barracks bombing and so forth. It was just not at the scale, but it was still strategic strikes on America. And it just wasn't in the thousands.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it took the events of 9/11 to wake up most of America to a threat that we had been seeing for a long period of time overseas. And I think if Al-Qaeda made any strategic mistakes, it probably was at that scope and scale. But I think even the collapse of the towers surprised bin Laden. That I have no doubt if they had not taken measures to that level, they probably still would be out killing today. overseas, it was like nobody inside the Beltway would devote the resources to the problem. And look, too, you had a very dysfunctional intelligence community during that time period. You had the FBI, you had the CIA, you had the State Department, you had DOD, and everybody was running their own show. Yeah, you had the Joint Counterterrorism Center that looked and sounded good from a bureaucracy perspective, but in reality, really wasn't working that well because everybody was kind of running their own show. And I think the events of 9/11 exposed some of those kinds of flaws and failures too. One could argue, has it gone too far with, the creation of countless joint terrorism task forces, the Department of Homeland Security, and joint fusion cells and centers around the globe. Around the country. So how much sharing is actually taking place on a practical level? I think it's gotten better, but I think that, in many ways, the lessons we learn from the big takeaways are the FBI has really kind of transitioned from a organization that would historically look at bank robberies and auto thefts to one of trying to prevent acts of terror at that scope and scale on U.S. soil. And in fairness to the Bureau, they've done a good job since that.
So let me maybe rephrase my question. In terms of surprise, I'm more so also looking towards the direction of, were you surprised that it happened in 2001 versus 1991?
I don't think they would have been, well, yes and no. I think they would have been very capable of carrying out, they bombed the World Trade Center in 1993. They made a tactical mistake by putting that IED inside the parking garage. Our modeling showed that if they had parked that VBIED street side, they would have had a lot more loss of life because of the flying glass. Don't get me wrong, it was a huge blast seat crater inside the parking garage, but it also dampened down some of the damage to the actual building. So in 93 or 91, they very easily could have gotten box cutters on planes and done the same thing. I just don't think they had the thought process of trying to pull that one off, or they would have been successful in 91 or 93, versus taking it to 2001. I mean, there's brilliance and simplicity when it comes to what they were capable of pulling off. Box cutters on planes, who would have thought, right?
Mm-hmm. So let me ask then, and it's crazy to say this, but there's certainly a group of people watching this that might not know. Did it take a leader in the sense of, somebody to kind of think of this plan? And obviously it was a horrific event, but again, you always need a kind of a catalyst for these situations. Did it take a leader or someone like Osama bin Laden? And maybe if you could, detail who he was and kind of the background foundation for 9/11 there. Was that maybe the piece of the puzzle that was missing, that as soon as they kind of had that proper leadership, it created, everything came to a head because, they had the foundation was all there. And now that they had a strategist or someone to push in that direction, you get to the situation that evidently was 9/11.
Yeah, it's a complex answer because I think you had an organization like Al-Qaeda that we started to watch in the 90s grow, but we called them the Afghan Arabs. We really did not know who they were. We knew that they were getting together. I remember one of my, I ran protective intelligence operations every year for the United Nations General Assemblies, where you have world leaders come around and we would brief all the agents. And I remember we would show them, we didn't even had computers in those days. We would show them pictures of these Afghan Arabs that potentially could threaten the likes of Egyptian diplomats, Egyptians heads of state. Boutros Ghali was the Secretary General of the United Nations at the time, and he was an Egyptian. And we had these terror threat warnings that this group might be going after Egyptian or American diplomats. And much like all other threat streams, we took it seriously, we briefed it, and obviously we lacked the human sources to be able to tell us exactly what they were planning to do, but we were aware of them. And I think that when you look in context of during that time frame, we really had this belief that they were not capable of carrying out a large-scale terrorist attack on U.S. soil. But I don't understand why we had that belief, meaning I think predominantly it was one of groupthink during that time period that all these events always happened overseas, and that we had not seen the likes of a Beirut embassy bombing on U.S. soil or a strategic strike like that. So, you could probably do a PhD thesis on the concept of surprise and groupthink in history and just looking back during this time period. I'm sure people have when you start thinking about it. But surprise for us was the norm. Was it because we did not have enough SIGINT, ELINT, HUMINT directed towards the problem? Yes. But in order to get those kinds of national assets redirected, it almost takes those kinds of catastrophic events for them to occur in order to to turn the battleship in a certain direction. So the one thing that the events of 9/11 did was laser fixate and turn the U.S. intelligence community, Five Eyes, and all of our allied partners onto this group to try to dismantle them. And, for the most part, it's been a pretty good effort and job because we haven't seen that type of attack since 9/11. And any other kinds of attacks have been lower level, your traditional lone wolf, lone shooters, those kinds of things here, at least inside the continental United States.
Let me ask about that, because that's something that I think people point to all the time. And I'm curious from, somebody that has an expertise on the topic in terms of what the day-to-day or week-to-week or month-to-month might look like. How often do you think that these attacks, of course, not on the scale of 9/11, but, something relatively similar within, the ballpark, are getting stopped by the different agency groups, are getting investigated, getting worked on? How often do you think that is happening?
I think pretty much if you look at it globally, probably every day. Mm-hmm. This week alone, you see the plots unfold, involving Iranian-directed plots utilizing criminal elements in Austria and Germany to target Israeli-owned companies and Jews in general. You had the Canadians and the FBI work to roll up an individual that was planning on coming into New York City to shoot up a large synagogue, Jewish location inside of Brooklyn. Those are win-wins for the counterterrorism community. And so that's pretty good examples of how often these kinds of events occur. What happens during this time period, the lead up for the U.S. presidential election too, is there is enhanced intelligence collection by predominantly the U.S. and Five Eyes, focused around the world, trying to look at any kinds of plots or threats that might try to disrupt our election. So you have enhanced intelligence collection. And I think the world since 9/11 has shifted into a very proactive intelligence collection mode on trying to ferret out some of these terrorist cells, whether it be the remnants of the old Al-Qaeda, ISIS, Hamas today, is obviously of interest, not only to the Israelis, but to the West. So there's been a very good effort at that from a counterterrorism perspective. And, my hat's off to to the community, to the intelligence community, for stopping these attacks from occurring.
So out of curiosity then, I think the pushback that some Americans might say is that we'll see from time to time when certain events happen, public shootings. I think the Trump assassination would be a great example. You'll have, and the FBI may come out and say that we did have eyes on this individual. Obviously, we didn't respond at the proper time. This was able to happen. Do you think there's just too many variables in the air that kind of leads to them missing smaller targets like that may be going for not necessarily presidential assassination, but, the local shooting or whatever it might be, because there's just so many different groups that they're worried about attacks on U.S. soil?
It's a good question. The acts of a lone gunman can change the course of history, as we almost saw with the attempted assassination of President Trump. You can look at all the different balls that were dropped in that, from a protective security perspective to a special event security to a protective intelligence failure to a technology failure. The list goes on and on and on. That shows you how close a single gunman can come to changing the course of history. Lot of mistakes made in that. A lot of mistakes from a protective security perspective. The Secret Service has course corrected and will no doubt fix those kinds of problems. And then this week alone, you have the horrific school shooting down in Georgia, where an individual was known, had been previously investigated, and is still capable of carrying out that kind of attack. Look, you're always going to have those human balls dropped. And I say this from just a counterterrorism strategy perspective. The mission of the FBI today is to stop a strategic strike of the scale of 9/11 on U.S. soil. That means a dirty bomb, a weapon of mass destruction, a major bombing of a critical infrastructure target, and so forth. And they've done a good job at doing that. You are not going to be successful in stopping these lone threat actors on any given plot or plan that they might have just due to the proliferation of potential soft targets around our great nation. So it's an impossible task in many ways to think that you're going to stop every school shooter, every lone gunman with a rifle or a pistol or an AK. What the record has shown since 9/11 is that the counterterrorism community is pretty good at stopping organized terror of two or more individuals, you and I deciding we're going to carry out some sort of a plot and attack together. Or like we saw with the plot being thwarted out of Canada, how that individual's out there on Telegram, why I don't know, looking for help, kind of low-hanging fruit to be caught where you can introduce an undercover in and so forth. So those are the easy ones to stop. The hard ones are the ones that are just setting back a Sirhan kind of person who shot Robert F. Kennedy in 1968 that you don't know about. And having said that, that lone individual is not going to be capable of carrying out a strategic strike at the scope of a 9/11.
Yeah, I just got to move this out just so I can keep an eye on it. So I bet the viewer would love to hear your perspective on this, because you were kind of highlighting it there as well. What do you think went wrong that led to the events of the Trump assassination attempt? Or what do you think were some of the key missteps that, maybe isn't getting covered by CNN or Fox News?
I think it was what is called a protective intelligence failure. In order to dissect what went wrong with the Trump assassination attempt, you literally have to go back to the Warren Commission on the assassination of President Kennedy in Dallas. Mm-hmm. And that's where the Secret Service learned that the sniper threat exists and that we have to create countermeasures to stop that from occurring. So they create a counter-sniper team. They also create what is called a protective intelligence division. At that time period, it was called a research division. And in every presidential visit, they're supposed to send out what is called a protective intelligence advance agent. And that's typically done from the protective detail or from headquarters. But I think what you had unfold with the Trump assassination attempt is, again, when things start to domino, things domino very badly in this business. You had the event take place in Butler, Pennsylvania, the week before the Republican National Convention. So you have a tremendous amount of national assets devoted to that, to include a lot of Secret Service post standers, Secret Service Uniform Division, Secret Service Special Police officers that are assigned various duties. So you have resources devoted there. Then, in essence, when you start looking at the actual day of event, you have a presidential campaign that's underway where you have the Secret Service protecting President Biden, Vice President Harris, former President Trump, Hunter Biden, all the formers. And traditionally what happens is that the formers, like Trump, don't get the same level of what is called PPD, Presidential Protection Division assets. Now, stop and think about that for a minute. From a threat assessment perspective, you could look at who was the highest rated threat protectee at that moment in time. One would argue, I would, that former President Trump was, and that he probably deserved as many assets and resources as President Biden had, was not afforded those. Was that because of resources, politics, operational decisions that were made that were just bad? But at the end of the day, when you start looking at that protective detail, you had a hodgepodge mixture of Secret Service agents from the Trump detail. Then you had additional Homeland Security investigators assigned to augment security. And then they work with the local authorities to try to augment the security that's in play. So at a basic level, you had human error. You had a lack of resources that were devoted in what is called pre-poster positions, meaning it's clear as a bell today. Every terrorist attack I've ever investigated is clear as a bell the day after. You and I would have looked at that and said, well, maybe we should have somebody on the roof. Mm-hmm. It doesn't matter unless that shot was taken. And the Secret Service, remember, is moving former President Trump and any protectee in and out of 2 or 3 different locations a day, if not more. And so they at times are just flying by the seat of their pants, and they just don't have the resources. Now, one could certainly argue as to where the oversight was. And if anything, that would be the question if I was saddled to investigate that. Let's look at the advance plan 24 hours ahead of time. Let's look at the threat assessment 24 hours ahead of time. Where were the pre-posters assigned? Who dropped the ball from certain locations, such as that rooftop? And go from there. So I know how these things happen. I've seen them happen my entire life, and they usually boil down to a lack of resources and a lack of oversight and a lack of wherewithal to be able to look at it with fresh eyes to say, hey, this is just not right here. And let's deal with these kinds of vulnerabilities as they occur.
So what you were just saying, you go in after the event and look at, where the ball was actually dropped. Do you think that is happening right now? Because I think a lot of people get worried about it. It seems like we moved on from that event so quickly, which in the moment, everyone felt like this is going to be, headline news for the next 6 months, all we're going to talk about. And with the way the world works and politics work, of course, the next week it's on to the next thing. But do you think that's happening right now in terms of just deep diving, what went wrong, who dropped the ball, and what changes need to be made? Or do you think that, we had the leader of the Secret Service resigned and we're all good, we can move on from this?
I think that there is adequate investigation that's underway by the FBI. The FBI is a very slow, methodical, bureaucratic organization that's been saddled to investigate a JFK kind of moment. So every step in that investigation is going to be micromanaged by unit supervisors, supervisory special agents, and you're going to have an assistant U.S. attorney and Department of Justice also look at that. They are going to march at the beat of their own drummer. They could care less what the American public thinks of their timeline. The Secret Service is going to obviously course correct internally from looking at some of the failures that were made. Also recognize that you got the Hill, like Senator Hawley and others that are looking at this very closely and holding them accountable for some of the balls that were dropped surrounding that. So I know one thing about the Secret Service from just studying tragedy that they've been saddled with over the years is they always course correct and do a better job as a result of that. I'm confident they will. But let's not lose sight too that, that's an extraordinarily difficult job. I've done protection. I've stood in hallways. You're traveling. You're tired. It's a campaign year. You can't get home for birthdays, holidays, children events. It's a very difficult job. And I think people don't understand that, how challenging that job is. I'm not defending what took place. I think there were horrific mistakes that were made. But I think the Secret Service will self-correct. I don't see any drastic changes until the presidential election. If Trump goes back into the White House, you'll see a shift in Secret Service leadership. I think you'll see a shift in Secret Service leadership if Vice President Harris is elected too. Those jobs are political, like most senior level positions inside the Beltway. And trust me, when I say this, I think they will fix whatever internal mistakes that they had, and they'll do a course correction and come out better for it.
So looking for more of a broader stroke, the political polarization that's happening in the U.S. has reached new highs. Having an assassination attempt near successful on a president is historic in its own right. I couldn't even imagine if, Trump had died on that stage. It would have just shifted history for sure. But in terms of looking at from a domestic terrorist threat, does it worry you seeing how polarized the country is becoming? And do you think situations like this will become more and more common with more political extremists on both sides?
It's an interesting question, and I think context is very important. Meaning, if you look at the time period between 1968 and 1972, I think the FBI investigated close to 3,000 domestic bombings. There was 130 domestic inside the United States hijackings. You had the assassination of Robert F. Kennedy, Martin Luther King. You had the bombing of the State Department outside my old office, took out 3 floors. The Pentagon, the U.S. Capitol, New York City Police Department, corporate headquarters, and so forth. So if you think back in context from what was called the days of rage between 68 and 72, we were living in a very violent society, which a lot of folks don't realize. Mm-hmm. You fast forward to today, we have nowhere near that level of domestic bombings. We did have a presidential assassination attempt that was unsuccessful. I'm not downplaying that at all. That's significant. But my point is that we are living in a very polarized society, and it's going to be interesting to see the run-up to the election as well as the fallout from the election and what that will lead to. The one thing that I laser fixate on looking at what's coming is the fact that the FBI still has not found or located or identified the January 6th bomber. That was the individual that left the improvised explosive device outside the Democratic building there inside the Beltway, inside of D.C. So that's worrisome. If I'm looking at that from a counterterrorism perspective, do we have a Unabomber kind of guy or gal that's still out there running loose? Obviously. Is it possible that he or she was rolled up in the January 6th and the Bureau just can't connect the dot? That's the one thing that I think about from a threat assessment perspective. So we were living in much more violent times that I grew up with in the late 60s and the 70s. We are living in a polarized time. It's hard to predict, the future when it comes to that level of violence, but predicated on what we chatted about before with the FBI's counterterrorism efforts domestically, I think they've got a pretty good handle on breaking the back on any kind of organized terror. on the left or the right, it's that lone actor, that lone threat actor that always worries me.
So I'm going to ask you to predict the future a little bit. What do you think happens post-2024 election? Because, of course, this is going to be, I mean, I joke about it with friends all the time. I feel like no matter who wins, it's going to be a chaotic situation, that next day. If you were in, pick whatever agency to head there, like what are your thoughts and what are you preparing for the day following election day or, the next inauguration day, whatever it might be?
Well, democracy is messy. Historically, when you look at that, I'm looking at the aspect of, depending upon who wins, you're going to have 50% thereabouts of America that's going to be disappointed and angry. Are they angry to the point of any kind of organized violence? I don't know. I have no doubt that the Bureau and Department of Homeland Security has a pretty good handle on what those organized groups look like today and are monitoring them, looking at their social media, looking at the YouTube videos, looking at whatever that might be to try to get in front of that threat. I have no doubt that they've enhanced intelligence collection to try to figure out what these groups are planning. You may recall a couple years back, like, for example, the plot against Governor Whitmer. So the Bureau is probably looking at things like that. So they're studying from the left or the right. I think if you had to predict, or forecast is probably a better term than prediction, you're going to see protest activity. You're going to see violence, in the streets of America. You're going to see some degree of relatively low-level anarchy, in my judgment. I have faith in the system today at stopping any real organized violence, targeting whether that be local, state, or government officials. So I'm confident that the U.S. counterterrorism community has got a good handle on the domestic threat. If you look historically, putting 9/11 up here inside the continental United States, and then you hearken back to the 60s and the 70s where you had predominantly the Weather Underground carrying out most of the major acts of domestic terror, and the Black Panther Party, the Cleaver faction. Most of the extreme acts of violence have been carried out by that lone threat actor, the Unabomber, a Sirhan, a John Hinckley, that kind of person. And that makes it extraordinarily difficult to try to find, which I also think attributes to the fact that the Bureau hasn't rolled up the January 6th bomber.
Mm-hmm. Let's take it to a global perspective. You'll have nations like Russia and China that, of course, want to play their hand in the U.S. in such a volatile time, especially an election year. How do you think that they're playing into all these situations as well? Do you think they're looking to fund these groups? Are they kind of doing counterintelligence manipulation in terms of, they want to help these solo actors be able to move forward without, having to rely on others or whatever it might be? Like how much does that worry you, the adversaries we have on the global stage?
I think from a national security perspective, it's a priority. It would be a tier 1 problem to try to get a handle on. Mm-hmm. If you look historically, the Soviet Union, predominantly Russia, had backed a lot of the domestic terrorist groups from the 60s and the 70s. I have not seen any smoking gun evidence other than a couple comments out of like Kirby coming out of the Washington as to they suspect or know that Russia, China, and Iran might be behind some of the fowling domestic discontent and so forth, predominantly over the internet and so forth via social media channels. Look, a fractured and dysfunctional United States is good for the geopolitics of Russia, China, and Iran. They are going to up that ante big time, turn up the Bunsen burner before the election to try to sow as much hate and discontent as they can here domestically. question becomes one, are we able to identify that ahead of time? Are we able to monitor that? Are we able to shut that down and so forth? I think last week, the Department of Justice and the Bureau did shut down a couple avenues and outed some Russian propaganda activity that's directed against the election and so forth. I expect that to continue. At the end of the day, the United States owns the cyberspace, good, bad, or indifferent, with five eyes. We own the cyberspace. So we should be able to get in front of this problem in my assessment. But historically, predominantly Russia has strongly supported, helped, assisted most of some of the domestic violence that have occurred inside the United States. I was doing some historical research for one of my books and came across an old FBI report from the late 60s or the early 70s where the KGB, Soviet KGB intelligence officer in New York City was looking at trying to put together an explosive device to set off inside the city in a Jewish neighborhood back during the 60s that would be blamed on the blacks. So those are the kinds of activities that I don't think you could rule out. Having said that, I have no doubt that we would be able to pick up on that pretty quickly. And P&G, the Russians that were involved with that, or nip that kind of threat in the bud.
Let me ask then, the Israel-Hamas war has obviously created a ton of chaos, of course, in the Middle East, but here in the U.S., we have protests all around the country. Social media has kind of become a hellstorm. Do you think that they have their hands in that as well? And how do you think that situation kind of continues to play out in terms of domestic security and possible issues that could come from that?
Yeah, that's really an interesting question because when you look, again, as a student of history, and you look at the violence that has spun out of that issue, such as the Israeli radical Palestinian corner, it has led to some of the more significant acts of terror around the globe, both inside the continental United States, such as the assassination of Rabbi Meir Kahane, as well as you're looking at some strategic strikes around the globe, going back to the groups like Black September. I think this is the kind of festering and continuing issue that will haunt your generation for the next 25 years. I won't live that long. My point is that this is the kind of issue that won't go away anytime soon. And I used to tell my analysts at some point in time that if you want job security for life, you want to be a Middle East analyst. And, specifically focus on Iran and or radical Palestinian issues. So this is not going to end well, I don't think. I look at the geopolitics of the region there. You got a very fractured Israeli nation today that, suffered this horrendous tragedy on October the 7th. But you can look at the spin-off attack that came out of Canada this week as to how that plot was put together as kind of an anniversary to carry out a shooting inside New York City as a result of the anniversary of October the 7th. So that's the kind of date and kind of problem and threat that's going to persist.
Is the connection clear there at this point in terms of we know it was in relation to Hamas and then...
No. Not relation to Hamas specifically, but the date.
The date.
Okay. The anniversary date in support of Hamas.
Mm-hmm.
So, in support of Hamas has led to Iran coming into the mix, the Houthis out of Yemen, and has resulted in just this overwhelming support of Hamas to continue to carry out attacks and so forth against the Israelis and so forth. If there's one thing I know for sure, just following the Israeli Mossad like I have for years, is, they won't rest until they hunt down and kill or capture Sinwar. That is their new Eichmann. And so I don't see any de-escalation of events until that happens.
Mm-hmm.
And then it's almost like a perfect storm of support for, like a nation state like Iran to augment and support Hamas to go against their bitter enemy, Israel. Meanwhile, Iran is sitting back trying to figure out what can I get away with my Iranian nuclear development program while the U.S. is dysfunctional and polarized with the upcoming election. You have all this anti-Semitic hate now around the globe. You have Bibi Netanyahu under a lot of domestic unrest inside the country. So it's kind of an interesting time from that perspective for the nation state of Israel.
Did it surprise you to see how much support for Hamas and the Palestinian cause was happening in the U.S.?
It was surprising. It still is. I look back on just the history of radical Palestinian terror targeting Israeli and Jewish targets and Americans. And I think folks forget that Hamas started this on October the 7th with their multi-pronged invasion of the state of Israel, which still surprises me because after the Yom Kippur War in 1973, the Israelis put together tripwires so something like that would never happen again. So the intelligence failure with the October 7th attack on the state of Israel, I find shocking.
Why do you find it? Of course, the fact that it was such a grand failure, but in terms of what do you find shocking? Like what were some of the failures that you think you would target or that you see now that you kind of can't believe, Israel let happen?
When you look at the past is prelude to the future, I think it was to paraphrase, I believe, Shakespeare. When you think in context of the 73 Arab invasion of Israel under Moshe Dayan, Golda Meir's watch, when the state of Israel literally was nearly destroyed. And as a result of that, it was so serious that they put together commission after commission to say this was a failure of our intelligence security services, our military. We can never, ever let this happen again. So fast forward here, 50 years later, and you had almost the exact same kind of scenario coming from Gaza with a multi-pronged attack by sea, by air, by vehicle, by foot on the state of Israel. I still don't understand how those kinds of intelligence signals were not captured and why the red lights weren't blinking that something's up. At the end of the day, I have my suspicions, meaning I think when you look at the state of Israel, they have been laser focused on Iran and the Iranian nuclear development program, and to a lesser degree, some of the radical Palestinian groups. And then all of a sudden, this window pops open where Hamas carries out this unbelievable attack on the nation state. I think that's probably also a resource issue or just losing sight of the ball. But it was an intelligence failure, which has now led to, obviously, these dominoes to fall with Israel invading and hunting down and killing all these radical Palestinians. So get back to our earlier point in our conversation when you start looking at the scope of surprise. And if you look historically as a result of surprise at the national security level, whether it's the U.S. or Israel, the response has never been proportionate. Mm-hmm. Look what we did as a result of Pearl Harbor. Look what we did as a result of 9/11. Look what Israel has done as a result of October 7th. So the response is never proportionate. It's usually very draconian, very massive, and usually results in a tremendous loss of life. In our case, our response from Pearl Harbor was to drop nuclear bombs.
So circling back then too, does it surprise you seeing a lot in the U.S. coming out in support of Hamas and Palestine and in a lot of ways speaking very negatively of Israel?
Yes, it surprises me. It surprises me for a range of different issues. As someone who has protected the likes of Yasser Arafat over the years, watched many, many Middle East peace conferences take place, Also knowing the history and scope of radical Palestinian terror and thinking back to the scope of destruction that took place when Hamas invaded on October the 7th, I think that, the overwhelming response by the nation state of Israel has caused a fair amount of blowback against them as a result of that. But my point is with that is Israel being the only democracy in the Middle East has been one of our staunchest allies when it comes on the war of terror since 9/11, that perhaps many people inside the continental United States either fails to remember or doesn't want to look at what took place on October the 7th. Don't get me wrong. I think that, some of the scope and levels of destruction and the humanitarian chaos that the war has caused has been horrific. But I also am fairly confident that the Israelis won't stop until, and they've done a fairly aggressive and good job of hunting down most of the Hamas leadership that was responsible for that, absent Sinwar. And I don't see them stepping back until they capture him.
So if this doesn't stop, I mean, where do you see it going from here? Like, because, Trump's a bit of a different animal, but if Kamala gets into office, there's so many calls from people within her party, even donors, it goes all the way up, to do something about Israel, whether that's, putting the hammer down or no longer, sending funding, whatever it might be. I mean, where do you see it going if we reach kind of that weird stalemate where the U.S. is put in a position where they're not going to stop, and yet we have this internal disturbance going on in terms of, us supporting Israel?
Well, I think historically, since 48, we have always supported Israel, regardless of whether you're Republican or Democrat in office. Remember, what is publicly stated at times is not necessarily what is covertly taken place behind the scenes. That relationship between the Mossad and the CIA and the Department of Defense is going to exist and transition. As we used to say in Washington, parties every 4 years come and go. And you have intelligence liaison relationships that have been in existence for years, and they're going to remain in play, meaning absent a new CIA director, which will happen unless Harris is elected. Burns may stay on, my supposition, or he may be to the point that I'm kind of burned out. I don't want to do this anymore. But those relationships are going to exist. The CIA station chief in Tel Aviv or Jerusalem is not going to be told to not talk to the Israeli Mossad. The U.S. military defense attachés are not going to be told not to talk. Depending upon who gets into office, you'll just see a lot of things perhaps just shift into the shadows. They've always been in the shadows. These relationships exist and just transition administrations. So you may not see a lot of public support depending upon who's elected, but I'm fairly confident you'll see the intelligence support continue forever.
So that's kind of, I guess, continuing with that, though. I mean, does that worry you? Because like we were just saying a little bit ago, we're already in a pretty polarized, tumultuous state that's happening domestically. If these groups of individuals are, protesting all over the country, and they've gotten more and more chaotic, taking over Columbia's library. I mean, if you have a president come in like Kamala who says one thing, does another, I mean, do we think that that's going to kind of just continue to revel up those people domestically? And I mean, in its own issues there, it's hard to let the foundations of the U.S. kind of keep cracking. You know what I mean?
I know what you mean. I think regardless of who is our next president of the United States, you're going to have continued protest activity on this specific issue.
Mm-hmm.
It's going to be fueled either by internal discontent, internal belief systems supported by Russia to watch these kinds of chaotic events occur. I don't see this dissipating, short of an Israeli complete withdrawal and step back from Gaza and just deciding they're just going to shut it down. The point is that I can remember back when we were at Middle East peace conferences in the early 90s. This is the kind of issue that I guarantee you will still be looking and reading and studying 25 years from now. There is no, we used to have a saying in the counterterrorism business that sometimes there are no good solutions. Sometimes you got to pick the best worst decision that you have. So you look at the scenario that's unfolding inside of Gaza and Israel today. What is the best worst decision and outcome that could happen? The Israelis are not going to step back and forget what took place on October the 7th. And the Palestinians are never going to forget what has happened since October the 7th. So you forecast out 25 years from now, you've got a generation of people, Palestinians and Israelis, most of which now have been called up repeatedly to serve in their military, mm-hmm. that are never going to forget this. This is kind of like a World War II moment for many of them, or Vietnam for, my generation, or the Iraq War, Afghanistan. This is going to be something that's going to be festering for the next 25 years.
So let me follow up with that then. Is there concern, though? You were mentioning Iran. For whatever reason, Israel dropped the ball on their border with Gaza there. They were, October 7th was able to happen. A lot of their focus was going towards Iran, what they were doing in the region, their nuclear program, et cetera, et cetera. Isn't it advantageous for them to push every direction for us to just keep focus on those two going at it domestically as well, so that they can keep, harboring their power, trying to continue their nuclear program, looking for ways to kind of create chaos in the region and continue, increasing their regional power in that area? I mean, is that something we should be thinking about as well? Because I feel like that conversation, I hardly hear their name come up as much as it should.
Well, I agree with you. Iran has pretty much kept me employed for 40 years. You go back to the embassy takeover, in 79, which kind of started the Islamic Revolution.
Could you maybe just highlight that?
Yes.
People.
In 1979, you had the U.S. Embassy seizure in Tehran, where, again, we were surprised. The United States was surprised. The intelligence community was surprised that you had this group of Islamic fundamentalists that were hell-bent on taking over and driving America out of Iran. And so they seize and take the U.S. Embassy hostage and hold our American staff, one of which was an old friend of mine, hostage for 444 days. And they were released when President Reagan came into office. I think that they were somewhat fearful as to what President Reagan might do once he was in office. But when you look at Iran, over the last 40 years, they appear to play chess and we play checkers. And they seem to know what kind of hot buttons to push. They worry me from a nation-state adversary because they're very much as capable today as the Russian SVR or the Russian Ministry of Defense. They're as capable as the Chinese intelligence service. And then they have these surrogates that are stationed in Beirut, like Hezbollah, and they have these outreach capability, their tentacles into groups like Hamas and the Houthis in Yemen. So, they are a nation state of terror and always have been. And we've never, ever been able to get that right. And if I look historically, they have been a thorn in our side since 79, and I think I've watched him grow just much more powerful over the years. And so to me, a nuclear Iran is frightening. I was speaking to an old friend of mine, Annie Jacobson, that has got a wonderful, she had a New York Times bestseller out recently called Nuclear War, a Scenario. And I was chatting with her about this topic. And, it's frightening to think what Iran could do with, tactical nuclear capability and delivery kind of capabilities there. Much like North Korea learned that if you have a nuclear weapon, there's a deterrence aspect. No one's going to bomb you, invade you, take you over. And, I understand the Iranian mindset to do that and the reasons why they want to be able to become a nuclear power. But I also strongly believe that the state of Israel, even with all their problems with Hamas and Gaza, that they won't let that happen.
Again, that kind of increases the scenario, though. I mean, timeline-wise, over the next couple of years, decades, whatever it might be, it doesn't seem like Iran has any reason to want to stop because, as you're highlighting, being able to gain the bomb creates all type of regional and global dynamics for them that are currently unreachable. I mean, do you see that continuing to escalate to the point that there is going to be conflict between those two?
Yes. I think that conflict between the West and Iran is inevitable.
Mm-hmm.
You look from an intelligence liaison perspective now, the Russians and the Chinese cozying up to Iran. That frightens me. I'm sure that frightens a lot of folks inside the Beltway, at Langley and at the Pentagon, at the State Department, at Foggy Bottom, because what kind of intelligence is being shared? What kind of spies are being shared? What kind of technology is being transferred between the three? Who's secretly helping Iran get a deliverable nuclear device outside the prying eyes of all of our technology and satellite and internet capabilities? And I think Israel is setting back, having learned this very hard lesson on October the 7th, thinking through their grandfather's Holocaust years and knowing that a nuclear Iran will ultimately pose a strategic threat to the survivability of the state of Israel forever. So at some point in time, I used to say in some of the talks I would give that I firmly believe that the only reason that Israel, specifically the Mossad, has not done something more aggressive towards Iran is that they had a good window of intelligence into their nuclear development program. Whether that be through HUMINT, SIGINT, ELINT, I don't know. HUMINT, they're pretty good on. You look at their recent capabilities of going into Tehran and killing the Hamas political leader. That's a pretty good counterterrorism operational kind of event. Killing him in a Iranian IRGC safe house in the heart of Tehran. That resonates inside the Iranian leadership and the IRGC that if the Israelis are capable of doing this, what else are they capable of doing? That's a deterrent. So I do have a degree of confidence in the Israelis neutralizing that kind of strategic capability, much like I have a high degree of confidence in the U.S. intelligence community and the FBI preventing another 9/11 here. Do you follow my logic train there?
Yeah, absolutely.
Those are two balls that nobody wants to drop.
Mm-hmm.
Those are two balls that can't be dropped. All the failures in bureaucracy and systems and dysfunction and Butler, Pennsylvania chaos, those are two big balls that can't be dropped. Time will tell if I'm right.
So how close do you think they'd have to get necessarily to warrant an all-out response from a country like Israel? Do you think it's always going to be utilizing, in-country assets for things like assassinations, whatever it might be? Or do you see how close does it have to get until they're putting boots on the ground, until potentially U.S. is putting boots on the ground or outright striking Iran to prevent them from getting, the bomb?
Great question. I think that when you look at this in context, the only reason the Israeli IDF hasn't struck thus far is because they have a good window into the actual development of the Iranian nuclear program, as evidenced by their ability to strike inside of Tehran. They obviously have good coverage of Iran. I personally don't think we'll see a day where U.S. assets have boots on the ground inside of Iran. I do see a day where the U.S. assists Israel in some sort of tactical kind of maneuver against Iran, providing intelligence support, SIGINT, ELINT, whatever that might be, refueling capabilities, air-based capabilities, and so forth. I do see that kind of support. I think that regardless of who wins the White House, that there's going to be a high reluctance of putting boots on the ground back in that area, much like there's a high degree of reluctance to want to put boots on the ground in the Ukraine.
Mm-hmm. So let me understand this then, because I think a lot of people get so worried about that situation as well, because they would say that's the catalyst to World War III, right? You'd have U.S. involved, you have Israel involved, you have Russia involved, you have China involved, and, Israel, Iran are kind of the proxy between all the great powers. It seems like you don't necessarily see it going that direction, or maybe you do, but I guess why, if not, why do you see it being more of just a local dispute versus snowballing into something a little bit greater?
I think that the battle will be moved into the shadows.
Mm-hmm.
You'll have a shadow war continue, which has always existed. For example, a few years back, you had the Mossad going into Tehran, targeting and killing Iranian nuclear development scientists. On the ground, boots on the ground inside of Tehran, killing Iranian scientists. Those are the kinds of actions that I anticipate will continue, could ramp up. And, behind the scenes, I'm fairly confident that the U.S. and the West, namely the Brits, MI6, would help, providing degree of intelligence support, whatever that they might need. Having said that, I think the Israelis are very capable of going it alone. And that's where the politics of the White House might dictate that level of support,
mm-hmm.
depending upon who takes the White House. But do I envision a hot war in that area? Not really.
Mm-hmm.
I think that you're going to see a steady state of what we have already seen, tit-for-tat attacks. I mean, I ask you this question. We have given the Iranians more than ample time to retaliate for the IDF striking inside of Tehran, for carrying out high-value target hits in Beirut, for the killing of General Soleimani, who was their Eisenhower in the eyes of the Iranian working class. And yet Iran has not retaliated to a large measure. Yeah, they've had plots unfold, allegedly targeting former Secretary of State Pompeo. There's those kinds of kind of persistent threats. But they haven't blown up the Israeli embassy in BA, Argentina, like they did on my watch, the AMIA building in BA, Argentina, like they did. Why haven't they? They've shown an extraordinary measured restraint. I think they understand the ramifications of ratcheting up events as well.
Mm-hmm. I guess the pushback there then would be if we look at a country like North Korea, right? I mean, they don't ever necessarily take too many steps forward. They'll shoot off missiles every now and again to try to make a point and remind everyone that they're on the global stage. But the fact that they got the nuclear weapon is a main reason why. I mean, there's a lot of other dynamics too, but essentially, like, we couldn't just go in there and invade and try to, get Kim Jong-un out of there because, they have a nuclear weapon. They will likely use it in a scenario like that. Similar for Iran, especially with how, chaotic that country's been, domestically over the past couple of years, especially, but, just historically, finding that nuclear weapon may be for, their government, the ticket to ensuring their kind of long lasting ability. So although they may be buying time right now and they're making smart moves and they understand that if they push a little too far, they're going to get hit even harder, I still feel like the weapon would be their end goal because they understand. Like if we look at Israel too, if Israel has no nuclear weapons, it's a very different dynamic than what's played there. And I guess that's what would worry many is like Iran doesn't necessarily have a reason to stop trying to get the bomb, because even if Israel just keeps killing, if they eventually pop out one day and say, hey, we have a bomb, that changes the global stage, that changes their global positioning in the region and globally. I guess that's the worry, is that they won't necessarily have a motivation to stop trying to get the big ticket item, although they can play smart. And like you were saying, playing chess instead of checkers, they want to get to that king, not just lose a pawn here and there. I guess what's your thoughts with that? Like, do you think that it's possible to drop the ball there too, and they're just going to keep moving until they can actually get that bomb?
I think they're going to consistently move forward in an effort to try to secure that bomb. Having said that, I think that the Mossad's number one tier one intelligence requirement is to garner and collect intelligence on Iran's nuclear development program and to put covert action measures in place to stop that from occurring.
I guess moving forward then, let's look at the other proxy war, for lack of a better word, that's happening in the world right now. It would be Russia-Ukraine. I guess it's not a direct proxy because Russia's actually directly involved. But I think one of the things that's very strange happening there right now is it seems like a lot of eyes have kind of fallen off what's happening in that region. There's a lot of tit for tat. Ukraine actually making a lot of progress in terms of their activity within Russia and whatever it might be. I mean, how do you view the situation that's happening on the ground there, and where do you think it goes? Because again, it feels like the news cycle, the American populace, like the eyes have just kind of fallen off, and all eyes are on the Middle East again instead of, seeing that war that's happening, in Europe.
Well, I think it's an interesting dynamic. I think that we as Americans kind of lose interest very quickly in issues.
Mm-hmm.
I think the 24/7 news cycle is obviously a contributing factor to the ebb and flow and interest in Ukraine. I think you get back, and I look at this historically again and think in context that the U.S. is in a pretty good position historically since World War II, combined with our NATO allies, to confront this kind of threat, because the whole purpose of NATO and our relationships, after World War II, were built up to confront these kinds of threats. So there's a natural working relationship to want to be able to help and to thwart that kind of threat from occurring. And I think you have much more stabilized nations helping you at times with our NATO alliances there versus what we ever have or can anticipate having in the Middle East in many ways as well.
Mm-hmm.
Where when you look in context and if you look at a map, about the only ones you can really count on any given day to help us, the United States, would be Israel and Jordan. Egypt, to some degree. Saudi, depending upon the day, maybe yes. So it's a different kind of dynamic. So I think that when you look at Putin, did he make a strategic mistake with trying to move on Ukraine, recognizing that he would not get the support that the Ukrainians would not get the support that they have? History will have to be the judge of that. We are nowhere near seeing the end of this. Certainly former President Trump has said that if he's elected, he's going to put a stop to both of these wars. And maybe he can. I look at them as very complex situations. I don't know who's going to give ground up there between Russia and Ukraine, but maybe a new administration could be successful in accomplishing that. I don't know the answer to that question. I think that, you've got a lot of NATO countries that's scared to death over what Putin has done. And, that kind of hot war being fought. Having said all that, if you look at just the clandestine support that the U.S. has given, along with the overt military support to the Ukrainians, is probably on a scale that we haven't seen since maybe Vietnam.
Mm-hmm.
With, I would take that back. Probably on the scale of our support for the Afghan Mujahideen when the Soviets invaded Afghanistan. So, the level of money and funding that has gone into the support of the Ukrainian effort is, quite frankly, it's probably surpassed that. I don't hold me to that, but I'm just thinking through, my historical timeframes here. It's probably surpassed what we gave the Afghans to fight the Soviet Union in Afghanistan.
Does it worry? I mean, I saw you posted an article about this on Twitter. Of course, it's been a common headline like every other week of the potential of nuclear use in the region. But in general, as you just stated, like there's no real end in sight for this war. Do you see escalation continuing and maybe going even further? And, how does that play into what our discussions are going to be in terms, global security? If that area continues to get hotter and hotter, attacks continue to happen in Russia, not dissimilar to Israel in the sense that Russia Putin suddenly just created his own existential crisis, dissimilar in the sense that Israel didn't necessarily create it themselves, but if we get to that type of situation where Putin's back is against the wall, I mean, where does that lead us?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think when you look at Putin, at the end of the day, most world leaders are rational actors. I think we like to paint and broad brush some of these individuals as, irrational, air quote, crazy. But I think he understands that it's one thing to say that we are going to revisit our nuclear options as it pertains to this war versus actually pulling the trigger. And I think that when you look at that in context, the only scary part of that, quite frankly, would be in a place like Russia, Putin has the autonomy to be able to do that himself or cause that to happen. Would he get to that point? To me, the fascinating aspect was that half-baked coup that almost tried to come down with the Wagner Group, which is fascinating to me. Historians 50 years from now are going to have an interesting time looking at that to try to examine exactly what took place. I don't see anything unfolding, in the near term with what really occurred there. I think time will tell on Putin as to whether or not he decides to go down that path. But there's a side of me that strongly believes that we are not going to reach that. That everybody knows the stakes when you start talking nuclear deterrence. And it's one thing to talk a good game. It's also another thing to actually pull that trigger. I can recall on one of my investigations and cases, and that was, the plane crash which killed President Zia of Pakistan in 1988 and our U.S. ambassador, and pretty much the entire Pakistani chief of staff, and there was nobody in charge of the government, and Pakistan thought India had done it, and they're both, thinking about pointing nukes at each other. But, calmer minds prevailed. And historically, too, you look at the Bay of Pigs and other flashpoints in the world, and, history will tell you that calmer minds will prevail in that kind of threat.
I guess I want to get to the U.S. border here in a sec, but to be fair to the viewer, I actually want to circle us back to Beirut, where we kind of all started. I did want to talk about, you did mention him, Bill Buckley. I'd love if you could deep dive him a little bit, his background and how he kind of ended up becoming such a pivotal character in the story of kind of what we were talking about at the beginning, how terrorism went from a small thorn in the side to evidently 9/11 and what that led to decades later.
Yeah, Bill Buckley, William F. Buckley, not the famed columnist, but the actual former CIA station chief, was an American hero. Bill Buckley grew up in the Massachusetts area, always wanted to be a soldier, used to play with soldiers as a kid growing up, according to his family. As soon as he could, he enlisted at age 18 in the U.S. Army and went to Korea for the Korean War, where he was awarded a Silver Star for bravery. Came back to Massachusetts on the GI Bill, went to college at Boston University, and became a commissioned officer in the U.S. Army, and actually became one of Kennedy's first Green Berets that went over to Vietnam as part of their special operations group when we were fighting insurgencies in Vietnam. While in Vietnam, he also joins the CIA and becomes what is called in that time period, and it still exists today, though it's a different name, as a paramilitary officer with the CIA. So after Vietnam, Bill goes back full-time into the CIA, where he becomes pretty much their firefighter, their smoke jumper, where he is dispatched around the globe to deal with predominantly insurgencies, communist kind of activity that's taking place, wars. He's not really your traditional case officer looking at the Soviet target, running spies inside of Moscow or wherever. He's pretty much a guy that's used to fighting in the bush. After the first U.S. Embassy bombing in 1983, which resulted in several members of the CIA being killed, Bill Buckley volunteers to go into Beirut and stand up the CIA operations, pretty much to become our eyes and ears inside of Beirut. As one of the gentlemen I interviewed for my book on Bill Buckley said, as people were running to the parking lot looking to get the heck out of headquarters, Bill was offering and volunteering to go to Beirut. He was that kind of person. He was always running towards danger. Well, while he was in Beirut, he was targeted and kidnapped by Hezbollah, or the Islamic Jihad organization, as we knew them at the time, which, if you stop and think about this for your viewers, think in our today's world of social media and YouTube and the internet, what the world would think of the CIA losing their senior man who's held hostage in a place like Beirut. You would have to fast forward to Benghazi to think about a similar kind of scenario when Ambassador Stevens was missing. So Bill was a captive of Hezbollah. I, at the time, was a special agent assigned to the CIA Hostage Location Task Force called the HLTF. And our job was to find Bill Buckley. And unfortunately, we could not. Bill was held with many, many other American and Western hostages, predominantly American, though a couple Brits at various stages. And he ended up dying in captivity as a result of what we thought at the time was pneumonia. He had been tortured, and badly, had been sick. The other hostages had asked the guards to get him a doctor. They never brought one in. But Bill died in captivity in Beirut. You fast forward a few years later, we were able to get a source to help us find Bill's body, and we eventually brought Bill home, and he's buried at Arlington National Cemetery. American hero. He's one of the gold stars on the wall, as you first walk into the CIA there on the right. He's actually the 51st star on the wall there.
How do you think his death and memory impacted and also changed our perspective on the war on terror and, where that situation was evidently heading?
Well, it was devastating for us, meaning the sense of failure on our part was tremendous. It's hard to imagine today the scope of carnage and outrage. Think in context. You had in 1983 the U.S. Embassy bombing in Beirut, which blows out the CIA station. Then you had the Marine Corps barracks bombing. Then all of a sudden you have all the Americans being kidnapped in Beirut, to include the CIA station chief sent into Beirut to get a handle on terrorism. Then we have, while he's a hostage, the embassy blown up again in 84. And the failure, that time frame is kind of, and I just thought of that, a microcosm of our failure, of everything that was going badly for us, the inability to get in front of the threat, the lack of human intelligence, the lack of American focus, the lack of resolve, the lack of let's hunt these folks down that were responsible for this. And whether it be justice or vengeance, I don't know. I'll let your viewers be the decision maker of that. I know that it just made us angry and very frustrated, and just a sense of failure, very, very vivid, when you hear of, how this poor man died in captivity, and hear the United States of America couldn't find one of their own. He was a hostage that was not forgotten because we were doing everything in our power to try to find him. We just lacked the sources, the technology, the intelligence liaison from our partners, the Israelis, the Brits, the French, the Lebanese, to be successful in trying to get him out before he died a very horrific and miserable death.
How do you think that impacted the agency? I think the most direct comparison I can think of immediately, as well as you may be familiar with Kiki Camarena from the DEA.
Yeah.
For lack of a better word, that kind of kicked their ass in gear in terms of taking, the cartels a lot more serious. Would you say the response to that was somewhat similar in terms of recognizing losing an agent like that? They were able to see both their failure and kind of how they really had to address the situation?
I do. I think, having lived through that era, it was hard to look at it in a context of, I certainly was no decision maker briefing the president on strategy or who was responsible for this. I was the guy in the weeds, debriefing the hostages, talking to the family members, running sources down, trying to put the pieces of the puzzle together. But I do know that inside the halls of the CIA and the State Department and the FBI, there was a great sense of us wanting to do something. I know at one point, I'm convinced, I want to believe that the White House would have greenlit an operation to rescue Bill if we could have found a location where he possibly had been held. I think President Reagan would have. I know at one point we had some suspicions of a location, and we had meetings with Joint Special Operations Command as to whether they had the tactical capability to go into Beirut and carry out a rescue. There was always concern of another Desert One, which was the 1979 effort where the U.S. sent the special operations teams into Iran to try to rescue the American hostages at the U.S. Embassy in Tehran. There was always fear of failure, that things could go wrong, much like the Abbottabad raid where a helicopter could crash and maybe we could lose more American Delta operators to hostage taking. But I have no doubt that I want to believe that if we could have pinpointed a location, but our lack of intelligence on the ground there, at the end of the day, was our failure point. We could never, ever put Bill Buckley, the CIA station chief, in a specific location, building, house, farm, on any given day to be able to lean forward American assets for a hostage rescue. We did a fairly decent job post hostage debrief of trying to figure out locations, but they were very general, meaning if you look at where your studio is located, we might be able to get a couple blocks around. Mm-hmm. We could never say that this is the door that needs to be hit. So how are you going to do that? Mm-hmm. And then the hostages, to include Bill Buckley, was being held in the southern suburbs of Beirut, which was Hezbollah country. And that was no man's land. That was we had no ability to get in there to get eyes on the target, so to speak. Very similar to what the Israelis are dealing with in Gaza.
Mm-hmm. So let me ask, I would consider, as you're mentioning there, you're operating to find, in your career, you're operating to find both hostage rescue and also a lot of terror assassins, people that are, committing assassination attempts or succeeding, and, you got to go in the investigation process from there. What does that look like in terms of trying to find some of these criminal actors who are committing, as we said, historic events, and then also, might be operating as a one-man band, might be operating a part of a larger group? What are the steps or process that even goes into investigating a situation like that?
I'll give you an example. We had two of our diplomats shot in 1986, one in Sana'a, Yemen, another in Khartoum, Sudan. Mm-hmm. Both of them were my cases. Both were identical in operation. You had two State Department communicators that were driving to work, one in Sana'a, one in Khartoum. A vehicle drives up next to him. Gunmen open up from a window and start shooting into the car. Doesn't kill either one of them. One survived by feeling that vehicle next to him and turning very quickly, and a round went into his head and followed around his cranium and exited the back.
Jeez.
Yes, very lucky. Another one hit his arm, left arm. Vehicle speeds off. That one was in Sana'a. He's taken to a hospital where he's operated on by a Cuban doctor and a Soviet anesthesiologist. You can only imagine, right? Mm-hmm. The Cubans have pretty good doctors, so pretty good medical care. Mm-hmm. He survives. Meanwhile, in Khartoum, similar scenario takes place. Our officer is hurt more badly there, and he's medevaced out to Wiesbaden, Germany. So my job at that point becomes the detective. It's not complex. You're dealing with the U.S. Embassy agent that's assigned there called a regional security officer. You work hand in glove with that regional security officer who's working with the local police or intelligence service to try to figure out what happens. And you very quickly learn that there are no standards of evidence collection. There is no such thing as Miranda rights. crime scenes are swept up, evidence is destroyed, or in some cases, the cops just won't help you. So when you're investigating these acts of terror overseas during my time frame, it really boiled down to your level of liaison relationship with that host government to help you. Remember, and for all your viewers out there as well, it's the host government's responsibility to provide security and protection for all accredited foreign diplomats on their watch. So, as you can imagine, the investigative capability in Sana'a and Khartoum was somewhat limited, dysfunctional. I was able to piece together the fact that these were Libyan-backed terrorist attacks. I was able to use an old, what we would call a Mr. Potato Head kit, which was called an identikit, where you would piece together little prototypes of hair and faces and mustaches and show that to witnesses and put together basically a sketch of the suspects. I was able to do that for both of those attacks. I have no computer to help me, no computer-generated kind of process or animation to help me at all. And then I'm able to take that drawing, give it to Interpol, give it to the CIA, look at it, try to compare photographs of known Libyan suspects during that window of time that might have been in Sana'a or Khartoum. So needless to say, these were daunting tasks. And if you went back to those files today, which no doubt are at the National Archives by now, you will find very incomplete, half-baked investigations, because I very quickly moved on to, I think it was a hijacking in Karachi, Pakistan, carried out by the Abu Nidal organization shortly thereafter. So there wasn't a lot of time and effort or attention paid on my watch during that time period. Compare and contrast, I went over to Madrid, Spain once on a rocket attack at our embassy, a mortar attack that nearly went through the window of our agent's office. Fortunately, it hit below. And the Spanish National Police were very capable and did a good job of identifying where the mortar was launched on the rooftop of a hotel. I went to the Spanish National Police Forensic Laboratory. They took me inside. I was able to get pictures of the actual launching device. I was able to get some forensics, some explosive residue from that. Able to bring that back to Washington. I can't remember if the FBI or the CIA examined that evidence, but able to figure out what kind of evidence was used. It turned out to be the group responsible for that was the old remnants of the Japanese Red Army, and they actually carried out a similar rocket attack on our U.S. ambassador's residence in Jakarta, Indonesia. So our job during that time period, as best we could, was to connect those kinds of dots. And curiously or interestingly, fast forward a few years later, that bomber from Madrid was captured on the New Jersey Turnpike by a very alert New Jersey state trooper with a bomb in his back seat. He was en route to New York City to carry out a bombing of a naval recruiting station in the city.
You know what, Ken Strange mentioned that on our podcast together, so it's kind of funny. That comes full circle. But I guess in investigating a lot of these different individuals and such, can you remember one specific one that really stood out to you, whether you thought of them as dangerous, overly violent? Like, which individual, when you went through that investigation process, stood out to you as kind of the one that, even if they weren't necessarily did the most damage, you felt had kind of the scariest feel to it, if that makes sense?
Be happy to. There were a couple, in the course of doing the debriefings of all the hostages held in Lebanon on our hunt for the CIA station chief, we were able to determine that the hijackers of TWA Flight 847 that was on the ground in Beirut, there's a very famous picture of a terrorist hanging out the window with the pilot and a gun to his head that you can just do an internet search and find it. They were responsible for the killing of a U.S. Navy diver that was on that TWA flight by the name of Robert Stedham. Robert was taken to the front door of the TWA flight, gun put to his head, shot in the head, and dumped onto the tarmac. Horrible act of terror. All captured live on TV. We were able to connect the dots between that hijack cell and the hostage takings. And we were able to identify three primary players there. One was Ali Atwa. The other was Hassan Izzaldin. And the third was Imad Mognia, or as we called him, the Ghost. And the Ghost, fast forward to 2008, was eventually assassinated in Damascus, Syria by the U.S. and the Israelis. But during the 1980s, the Ghost was responsible for all of the hostage takings of the Americans, the U.S. Embassy bombings, the Marine barracks bombing. And so at my desk in Washington, I had his picture. I had this grainy surveillance picture of him that I think we got from the Israelis, kind of thumbtacked to my wall. And I knew if there was one person that we had to find and get, it was him. Mm-hmm. So back at the CIA, what we would do in our weekly meetings about the hostages being held would be, we would try to figure out ways to get to the Ghost. You know, who was he really? What was his relationship with Hezbollah? What was his relationship with the Iranians? Is there any Iranians we could follow to kind of triangulate in on him? And he turned out to be pretty much a hand-picked assassin working for the Hezbollah leadership. He ultimately was responsible for the Hezbollah security services, and he had direct intelligence liaison relationship with the nation state of Iran. So he was being supported very aggressively by the Iranians, and he was the one that picked the suicide bombers on the attacks against our embassies, was part of the kidnap team that kidnapped Bill Buckley, the CIA station chief. But we could never get him. We could never find him. He traveled on multiple passports, Iranian diplomatic passports under alias names, Lebanese passports, in and out of Beirut, Tehran. We just could not find him. And you fast forward many, many years later after I left and had gotten out of that business per se, he's hunted down and assassinated in Damascus in 2008, if memory serves me right.
So how does an individual like that stay off the radar so long? Is it just...
You could during that time period.
You don't think anymore?
Not anymore. In our day of biometrics, the computer, the facial recognition, the internet, social media, the surveillance technology that's on pretty much every street in the world today, except certain elements of the third world, it's kind of easy to hone in and track people. I'll give you an example. I was doing research on the Black September organization, which again was a group that was responsible for the killing of the 11 Israeli athletes in Munich. And in declassified documents that I have, the leader of the Black September organization was traveling to the United States with an official Algerian passport under an alias name. And as you deep dive that group, the Black September organization from the 70s, you'll see that they were carrying multiple Algerian, Iraqi, Libyan, and diplomatic passports and alias names globetrotting around the world, and there was no ability to track any of them. So you could get away with murder like that in those days. It's tough to do today at that level.
In terms of the communication at that time as well, with someone with the name Ghost, clearly it's, very off radar. Was there, you think, a lack of communication across the board between the different agencies as well as trying to locate this individual versus, today there might be more, their face may be more broadcasted everywhere. They're going to become, the mainstay in every agent's office, like you were saying, being pinpointed on the wall. Do you think that was part of the problem as well, as this person was able to kind of sneak under the radar?
Absolutely. Absolutely. In 1976, for example, we had a State Department Foreign Service officer, Yale grad, former military intelligence, literally bludgeoned to death his entire family inside his house in Bethesda, Maryland, and flee the United States, and he's never been found.
Really?
He was the oldest man ever to be put on the FBI top 10 fugitive list. And we had a case in our outfit to try to find him around the world. In 1976, you could easily vanish and acquire a fraudulent identity, become a new person. You could pay cash for an airline ticket. There was no immigration checks or vetting of you and me anywhere. Today, instantaneously, you can broadcast a bolo around the world. You can get an Interpol red notice, look out for anybody with just a flick of a couple buttons. So it's just a different era. In the 60s and the 70s, well into the 80s, the ease of travel for these terrorist operatives or mass killers was pretty damn simple. And you could vanish without a trace. And that's just how technology and our societies and law enforcement tools and technology have evolved since that time period.
So this will be a little bit of an out there question, but if you had to set a plan today for pick whatever agency group for an assassination on a high value target, what are some steps that you would be taking, to be able to complete this without making a lot of fuss? So, obviously, of course, what we saw with the Trump assassination attempt would be right in broad daylight, but a lot of these agencies operate in the dark and they want to be able to, whoever might be get away. What are the modern day processes in terms of how they would handle a situation like that?
If we have a very good case study, if I was teaching this at an intelligence assassination school today, would be how the Soviet/Russian FSB, SVR got rid of the Wagner boss. They either put an improvised explosive device on his plane or had a human asset carry an improvised explosive device onto the plane. Mm-hmm. You find someone or a vulnerability in that way. Aviation, I know from just my work on plane crashes from Pan Am 73 over Lockerbie to the PAC-1 Zia plane crash in Islamabad, that although it can be a complex kind of operation, it's relatively simple if you have access to that aircraft or helicopter. I wrote about the recent helicopter crash in Tehran that killed their foreign minister. And, of course, your mind wants to fast forward to that would have been the kind of operation that you could very easily attribute to a nation-state intelligence service. Having said that, it's easy to default to that too when it could be something as simple as catastrophic mechanical, or weather. So, but hopefully that answers your question.
What's your general opinion on that one?
At the time, I hearkened back to the 88 Zia plane crash, as, a case study that I would have been looking at back in the day to kind of model what occurred. I know that the Iranian government came out with their official results that it was a result of weather. I think weather might have certainly been a factor. However, I'm enough of a realist to understand that that's also an easy out for the Iranian government to be able to not admit that they were not capable of protecting their own senior officials. I don't think we'll ever know the truth, short of a defector that comes out from the Iranian government and or a defector in place that might be reporting back to either MI6 or the French or the CIA to disclose exactly what they think happened. I'm on the fence when it comes to that one.
Pivoting from, we were speaking on with the acronym GHOST, another one that I think would get some reactions was the Merchant of Death, where we had that the trade with Brittany Griner, and he was released. Does an individual like that in the modern day, does that worry you, seeing somebody operating or back operating, with that type of acronym and nickname as well, obviously with strong connections? Similarly, in a time when, you have issues happening in Africa, we have what's going on in the Middle East, we have what's going on with Russia, Ukraine, having an individual back out on the streets, quote unquote, like that, how do you view that? And what do you think the talks are in the agencies right now about that?
Well, spies have been traded, since the Cold War, since the end of World War II. And so that did not surprise me in the least. I know the Russians always drive a hard bargain to try to show that they're going to try to bring their intelligence operatives home. That does give the U.S. a little bit of leverage with that at times, to where, okay, who is it that they have that we really need to get back? So those kinds of swaps don't bother me, because I know that they exist, and that at times that's the only way you're going to recover whoever it is that you're trying to bring back. And so it's much like, if you look in context of, we've talked a lot about Israel today. On my watch, we had Jonathan J. Pollard, who was a spy for the state of Israel. He was working for the U.S. defense agencies, but he was spying for the state of Israel. And that was the most vivid example that I can recall in my watch, where you learn that, there are no friendly intelligence services, that each nation is going to look out for their own national security and intelligence interests. The thing that was infuriating with the Pollard affair, for those of us at the time, was that we would have given Israel anything that they wanted, within caveats, if they had just asked. But yet they decided to steal our own secrets for the benefit of their own nation. And we gave Pollard back to the Israelis after he served, I think it was about 20 years in prison. Was that long enough? Who am I to be the judge? Maybe, 20 years for selling out our country. He was a committed Zionist, committed Israeli, believed what he was doing was right for the self-preservation of the state of Israel. He was a traitor in many of our eyes. Probably could have languished forever in jail for some. Maybe the older I get, the less hard I am when it comes to that. I think he served his time, went back to the state of Israel, and I don't even know if he's still alive today or not. But, spies have been around, the second oldest profession, right? And, these kinds of swaps, if it's in our interest, why not?
So discussing spies and kind of the opportunity for them to make their way in the U.S., you have a lot of experience down south at the border, and we've obviously seen a rapid influx over the past couple of years of different migrant groups coming through the border there, as well as the cartel. It surprises me how little some people still pay attention to the fact that, you can look over the border, as far down, like a little bit south of San Diego and see the Sinaloa cartel just waving right at you. I guess in your perspective, how do you deal with those type of security concerns, understanding that, thousands of individuals with no real security measures are coming through, weekly?
Yeah, it's certainly a national security issue. The scope of special interest aliens, sex offenders that have been rounded up. We have no idea as to the background of many of those special interest aliens. What I mean by that is, let's say, for example, an Iranian national, an Iraqi, a Libyan, for example, Palestinian, where they might be or where they might have gone. It's the kind of potential that if you start thinking through it from a counterterrorism perspective, when will we see one of these individuals carry out some sort of act of terror? Now, in fairness, we have not thus far. Having said that, I think the scope of individuals that have come in under the radar, we clearly have no idea as to how many, truthfully, especially the getaways, where they could be, how they could be utilized in some capacity. In fairness, probably 85% are here for just purposes of immigration to flee their country. But there's a good number that, are criminal elements. We've seen evidence of these horrific murders around our great nation of individuals, associated with this. Some problems, I think, are unfixable, and this might be one at this stage due to the scope. Mm-hmm. I learned that hard lesson in the counterterrorism arena. I don't know how you even attempt with the reduced ICE, the current, ICE bandwidth and resources, where you go about finding these individuals today and bringing them into custody to where you can deport them back to their home country of origin. I think that's going to be somewhat of a daunting task, provided someone decides that there's resources to be able to do that. I think at best what you have to probably try to do is manage some of these day-to-day gangs that are prevalent, as we see in the great state of Texas and around the country. And as you pick up individuals that might be here illegally, move towards deportation at that juncture, I think that's probably the only workable solution. I'm thinking from just a counterterrorism perspective.
What's your viewpoint on the cartels? As I highlighted, they're only getting stronger. And recently, I don't know if you're familiar with Elmayo Zambada, but he was just arrested in Houston, actually, funny enough. And he was the leader of Sinaloa. So, now there's a leadership vacuum there. We have other cartel groups like CJ&J, which is slowly taking over a lot of southern Mexico. I mean, how do you see that as well, being, we're having essentially what's a narco state right on the border?
Well, you're looking at a very fractured nation due to predominantly the public corruption. A few years ago, I had the wonderful opportunity to chat with the Mexican foreign minister, the Mexican ambassador to the United States, the Mexican consul general. And I specifically raised this issue. And one of the responses back was, these are very good public civil servants, said, until we get a handle on our corruption problem, none of these kinds of issues are fixable. And we've seen that historically with Mexico, from whether it be the head of their CISEN, their intelligence service, to police corruption. But having said that, we've seen it on our side of the border too. A few years back, you had the assistant special agent in charge of the FBI in El Paso that was arrested for public corruption. You've had entire narcotics units of local border sheriff on the U.S. side being arrested for public corruption. So it certainly flows both ways, to the point that I don't know how you get your handle on that kind of systemic kind of problem. Where do you begin? Do you say, okay, starting south of San Antonio, we're going to, institute massive public corruption investigations? But you and I are in Texas. One of the things that was a wake-up call for me when I moved here from Washington, D.C., was the sheer scope of the border, 1,500 miles, 2 time zones. The ruralness of it as you get into West Texas. And then you go into a city like El Paso, and you're right on I-10, and you look over, and right there's the border. Or I was just down in Pharr teaching a class, and Pharr, Texas, in South Texas, near the border. And the culture and the geography and the family interactions between the U.S. and Mexico is one that I had no understanding of until I moved here. So it's a complex problem that I think that cannot just be solved with law enforcement.
Mm-hmm. I mean, the other factor as well is, you're just mentioning you go right to the border, and Juarez is
right there.
Right there. And it's quite literally owned by the cartel. I mean,
right, the plaza.
Exactly. And it's one of the most powerful, and Tijuana is another, two of the most powerful dynamics right on the border. I mean, you have some people that have some calls that say we need to send boots on the ground type of deal down there, special operations, whatever it might be. I've had spec ops guys on both sides of the ball there that have said, yep, let's get right down there. And I've had others that say that makes no sense at all. Like, we should not be, moving down there. I mean, how do you see that situation? Do you think that we're kind of shooting ourselves in the foot if we do that, because we're creating an already chaotic situation into something even more chaotic? Or is it a very real security concerns that these cartels continue growing in power, essentially becoming paramilitaries? And again, they're, 10 feet away at some areas.
Yeah, I know. It's an interesting question. When you look, I mean, a few years back, we had an ICE informant shot and killed here in Dallas at a high-end coffee shop. And so the spillover kind of violence here in Texas alone is somewhat shocking. I look at it this way. I don't see the State Department, regardless of whatever administration is in power, authorizing any kind of boots on the ground operation inside of Mexico. I think that we should do what we can do quickly, such as secure the border with whatever physical security assets and boots on the ground on our ground that we can deploy in order to do that. Meaning, if you look at our support for the Ukraine, you look at our support of Israel, we certainly are very capable, if we really have the political will, to secure our own border through personnel and technology. And that has historically ebbed and flowed. And that is where policy pretty much drives that decision. So whoever is the next president of the United States will have a high degree of say over what happens there. To me, the more shocking aspect of this is, as I look at this at my age and thinking back, and Kiki Camarero, that happened on my watch, by the way, is the scope of fentanyl that's flowing into our nation, originating in China, coming across through the cartels, the human smuggling, which has almost surpassed drug trafficking when it comes to just the sheer money that these cartels are making. The cartels have been there. I remember when I was in Washington, we started the Counter Narcotics Center. It's always been an issue that's being monitored and watched, but it's kind of an unfixable problem because you do need a high degree of assistance and help from the Mexican authorities, which has, again, internally ebbed and flowed as well, too. Sometimes they're willing to work with us on certain things, and other times they're not.
Mm-hmm.
I remember when the Zetas killed Tiffany Hartley's husband there at Falcon Lake, and the outrage. Here you had a beautiful wife out with her husband on Falcon Lake, which is right on the border. The husband is shot and killed by the Zetas when the Zetas owned that plaza. And of course, the U.S. tries to investigate that. And the Zetas actually picked up and killed the shooters because it was bad for business for them to have shot and killed this American. You know, at the end of the day, the cartels exist to make money. So, you know, to me, the only thing they've ever focused on is when we've put the hammer down on their money-making operations, however best we can.
So do you think that would be a key difference then if we compare them to Hezbollah? Like a lot of people like to do that. They like to say that they're essentially terror groups.
Apples and oranges.
So would you say the key difference, though, is that we would never have an October 7th type event coming from the Mexican border?
Correct.
Purely because it's money versus religious extremism type of deal?
Exactly. You're not going to see the Sinaloa or the Zetas or any of the fractured groups decide to attack the U.S. in San Antonio, El Paso, Far, Texas, because that's the quickest way to shut down your money-making operation. And for them, it's all about that. I don't see that ever happening. You know, if you even think back, you had a few years ago, you had our consulate, the U.S. consulate in Monterey, that was, and a couple of our diplomats, some of our agents, I think, were shot at. And that really caused a very aggressive Mexican military and U.S. response to that. And so, you know, unlike your Hezbollahs, your ISIS-Ks, your Hamases of the world, don't get me wrong, Hezbollah likes to make money, but they have other revenue streams. And for the cartels, you know, this is all about money.
Continuing with that, though, doesn't that necessarily mean that they're a little bit easier to be bought and paid for by whatever government entity wants to come in? I mean, China is utilizing them, although the CCP likes to deny it. You know, they're funneling fentanyl right to there, teaching them how to cook it, flip it, and get it right up the border. I mean, I feel like that's a massive security concern as well, is that these countries can come in, you know, a couple of handfuls of cash and get them to do whatever it might be, whether that's smuggling someone across the border for nefarious, you know, activities, whatever it might be, or what we're seeing China do. I mean, is that something that do you believe we're keeping a keen eye on as well and really understanding like where those finances might be coming from?
I think we're aware of that. I don't think we're keeping that keen of an eye on that problem. I think that any of these nefarious groups are very capable of sending these operatives in the United States, for the intent of putting together, let's say, some sort of terror plot. I also think that the cartels could care less about who they're smuggling across the border, as long as someone's paying that rate, for whatever that might be. The counter argument to that is, and I've heard it historically for years, is show me the documented case where two Hezbollah, Al-Qaeda, ISIS-K, whoever, have come into the United States and shot up an American target that you can directly link back to the border. I'm not saying that's not going to happen at some point in time. It's just these terrorist groups have managed to either self-radicalize those operatives here in the United States, like Major Hassan, a U.S. Army physician, or other terrorist operatives here in the United States. They really haven't had to go to that measure. They've taken advantage of either legitimate transit here in the United States, visa fraud, passport fraud, or this one from this week that was rounded up in Canada. He intended to just drive across the border and carry out an act of terror. So time will tell. But if you look back, I'm thinking off the top of my head over the last 20, 25 years, I'm not aware of a documented case. Granted, you probably have had hundreds of special interest alias on various terrorist watch lists that have been picked up. That's a positive. but I've not seen one pull the trigger.
With how flooded the border has gotten, though, would you say that it's only a matter of time? Because
Yes, I would.
And why would you say that?
Just due to the holes in the border, the lack of any kind of immigration policy, the overwhelming numbers of individuals that are coming in daily and nightly. You can only look at some of the media and watch some of the footage that has unfolded. You have no idea who these folks are. And the getaways bother me. And, you can see some reporting along the border, which is pretty good, where they interview individuals and ask them where they're from. And they readily admit where they're from. I think it's a matter of time before you see. And, again, I don't want to be insensitive to the criminal acts that have taken place by some of these individuals that have come into the country and carried out violent attacks on females, students, college kids. This is horrific. And, is that terror? If you look at the Department of Justice guidelines, it's certainly not politically driven, which by any stretch of prosecution is what they utilize for a political terrorism charge. But it's certainly terror for that victim and family. So we have enough examples of the violent criminal actions that have taken place for something more to be done. And, but I think the problem, again, is one of scope. I'm not so sure federal resources exist to round up the numbers that are currently here if everything came to a screeching halt today.
Let me follow up with then, similar to 9/11, where you kind of needed that peak to really have the full force of America behind the situation. Do you think that we won't address the problem until it's essentially too late, until something drastic happens that we can directly connect to the border, and therefore we'll have to address the problem because, now it's in front of for everyone to see?
Yes. We learn slowly, and it usually takes a catastrophic event in order to move America in one direction, whether that be the invasion of Iraq or Afghanistan, dropping the bomb on Japan. It's going to take some sort of catastrophic event, because you can only look at what we've experienced already as a nation with criminal-related activities affecting families, the fentanyl surge inside the United States, to see that certainly has not done any good or wanted to cause some sort of national will in order to fix this problem. The immigration system is certainly broken. I think most people would realize that. There has to be legal pathways for citizenship. We need that for certain jobs and key industries here in our country. But just allowing, kind of an open door access for individuals to come in, especially as evidenced by some of these horrific acts of criminality that have taken place across our country. But that's a long-winded answer to your question. It's going to take some sort of catastrophic event, I'm afraid, in order to affect change. To affect change, you need national will. Mm-hmm. And you need enough outrage that tips the scales.
Circling everything back, again, with 9/11 being the anniversary being tomorrow, everything we've covered today as well, when we look at especially the younger demographics of people who are on a lot of times, opposing Israel, might be on the side, even praising Hamas in some sense. Do you fear that there's a sense that the day that we were never supposed to forget, a certain population of the U.S. has essentially forgot?
I do. I think much like the nation state of Israel forgot the Arab invasion in 1973, which was the Yom Kippur War, we have a generation of people that have grown up since 9/11, and that was a long time ago. And when I talk about the history of terrorism, and I go back and I talk about the Black September massacre of the 11 Israeli athletes at the Olympics in Munich, or I talk about the assassination of Rabbi Meir Kahane in New York City, or I talk about the first World Trade Center bombing with Ramzi Youssef in 1993, or the bombing of Pan Am 103 over Lockerbie, Scotland, or the U.S. Embassy bombings in 83 and 84, the kidnapping and murder of our CIA station chief, you can see and tell that people just don't remember. I'm not saying they don't care. At times, they're just not students of history, or maybe I'm the problem. Maybe I'm the lifelong student of terrorism history, and I can't let it go.
Mm-hmm.
I would hope that folks don't let these acts of terrorism go, and that people will remember them forever.
That would be my follow-up is, what do you think that we should do now to avoid the need for there to have to be another drastic event, as we were just discussing, to have a 9/12? What do you think we could do now instead to be able to have a 9/12 in terms of America coming together, people remembering what the country stands for, who the individuals around us are, without needing, such a drastic event or anything?
I think it takes education, awareness. I think it takes a desire on the part of our schools, our universities to teach these topics. I think it begins with the individual wanting to learn how we got here as a nation. The past is prelude to the future. History matters. I think that's the only way we learn, so we don't suffer the same mistakes time and time again. And if you look at the history of just mass casualty, it's the kind of incidents that cause large numbers of people to stand up, serve, join the military, want to become firefighters or cops or EMTs, or to be public servants, to teach. And having said that, I think that our nation has never been prepared better than it is today to deal with the current threat landscape that we're living in, because of the hard lessons we learned after 9/11. So I'm confident in the intelligence community of our nation, because I know they have good men and women behind the scenes working hard, trying to stop that next kind of event from occurring. So I am optimistic when it comes to that. I just don't think, I think we have unrealistic expectations as citizens that our protectors are always going to get it right.
Mm-hmm.
And I think there's too many threats coming at us for us to catch them all.
I guess wrapping up, if we had to take a perspective on what you think is the biggest security threat currently facing the U.S., if you had to pick one area of where we're going to focus, which item would it be?
I think the polarization of our country with our impending election, not knowing the outcome, is exciting to some degree, but I also think that it has the potential to bring us back into that 68 to 72 time frame where violence could be on the horizon.
Well, that's fantastic, Fred. Thank you so much. If you want to give a quick shout out where everyone can find, your different books, your articles, everything like that, just let the people know. It'll also be linked below, but if you want to shout it out quick.
Sure. If anybody would like to read any of my books or follow me, I'm certainly on social media, Twitter at Fred _Burton, I believe. I'm also on Instagram, and then you can find my website, which is officialfredburton.com. So thank you for having me.
No, of course. Thank you for everything. We'll make sure that's all linked below. And yeah, thank you.
Thank you.